11 kilometers down in permanent black, something is alive that should not be. Water here pushes with the weight of 50 jumbo jets stacked on a single point. A steel submarine would fold like a soda can, yet a fish the size of a pen swims through it, hunting, unbothered. You're about to drop into the Mariana Trench, the deepest scar on planet Earth. We will meet a creature with no bones, only jelly and nerve. We will find boiling vents standing next to water, cold enough to numb skin in seconds. We will see the exact spot where two men waited 5 hours in total darkness, not knowing if they would rise again. If any of this pulls you in, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know. The trench does not care about pressure limits. It breaks them, then builds new life inside the wreckage. Prepare yourselves, we begin. Picture standing on a beach, toes in warm sand, waves rolling in soft and easy. Now picture that same ocean, but instead of stopping at your ankles, it keeps going down, and down, and down. Almost 7 miles straight below you sits a place called the Challenger Deep, the lowest point on the entire planet. 7 miles does not sound like much on a map, but turn it sideways and think about it as a stack. Stack the height of 250 Empire State Buildings on top of each other. That is how far down this spot drops. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, could sink into this hole, and its peak would still sit more than a mile underwater. At the surface, water feels light. You float in a pool without thinking twice, but water has weight, and it stacks the same way air does above your head, except water is heavier. Every 33 feet you go down, the weight above you grows by another full atmosphere, another full push equal to the entire sky pressing on your body. Multiply that by the distance to the bottom of this trench, and the pressure becomes something close to 8 tons pushing on every square inch. Picture 50 loaded jumbo jets stacked on a single point the size of a stamp. That is the world waiting at the bottom. A human body cannot survive that pressure unprotected, not for a second. Lungs would collapse instantly. The pressure would not just hurt, it would crush bone and tissue before pain even had time to register in the brain. Submarines built from steel, tested for war and built to survive depth charges, would implode like a soda can under a boot. Yet something lives down there. Not bacteria clinging to survival in some dormant state. Living, moving, hunting animals, thriving in the one place on Earth built to destroy anything that enters it. This trench sits in the western Pacific Ocean, east of the Philippines, near a chain of islands called the Marianas. From above, the ocean here looks like any other stretch of tropical blue water, calm and inviting. Nothing about the surface warns you what waits below. No sign, no ripple, no clue that just beneath the boats and the sunlight, the ocean floor splits open into a wound 11 kilometers deep, the deepest scar on the surface of our planet. Scientists did not even confirm this trench existed until survey ships dragging rope over the side kept running out of rope. That was in 1875, more than 150 years ago. Since then, only a small handful of humans have ever gone down to see it with their own eyes. Fewer people have touched the bottom of this trench than have walked on the moon. Why does a scar like this exist at all? Why here, in the middle of the Pacific, and nowhere else on Earth quite like it? The answer starts far below the seafloor, in a collision that has been happening for tens of millions of years. One so slow you could stand on top of it your whole life and never feel it move. But it moves, and it built the deepest place we know. Most people picture a trench like a hole, a round pit punched into the seafloor. That picture is wrong. The Mariana Trench looks nothing like a hole. It looks like a scar, long, narrow and curved, stretching across the seafloor for about 1,500 miles. That is roughly the distance from New York City to Denver, except this scar sits entirely underwater, hidden from every satellite photo of calm blue ocean above it. A scar needs a wound to form it. This one came from 2 massive slabs of Earth's crust slamming into each other in impossibly slow motion. The Pacific Plate, one of the largest pieces of crust on the entire planet, pushes westward every year, creeping forward about as fast as your fingernails grow. It runs directly into a smaller piece of crust called the Philippine Sea Plate. When 2 plates collide, one of 2 things happens. They can crumple upward, pushing rocks skyward the way India crashing into Asia built the Himalayas, or one plate can bend and dive beneath the other, sliding down into the Earth's interior. At the Mariana Trench, the second thing happens. The Pacific plate is older and colder than the plate next to it, which makes it denser and heavier. Heavier rock sinks, so instead of crumpling upward into mountains, the Pacific plate bends downward and slides beneath the Philippine Sea plate, disappearing into the mantle below. That bending point, right where one plate dives under the other, is the trench. Picture bending a stiff rug at the edge of a rug pile. Right at the crease, a deep fold forms before the rug slides underneath. The ocean floor does the same thing, just on a scale that swallows mountains. This kind of collision is called subduction, and it has been grinding away here for more than 50 million years. 50 million years is longer than humans, elephants, or even horses have existed on Earth. The plates have been locked in this slow-motion crash since long before anything that looks like us walked the planet. The trench is not the same depth everywhere along its 1,500-mile length. Some stretches sit around 7,000 meters down. Others plunge past 10,000. The deepest section sits near the southern end, in a spot called the Challenger Deep, where the diving plate is oldest, coldest, and heaviest, pulling the crease down farther than anywhere else along the scar. Subduction zones like this one are not calm. The two plates do not slide smoothly past each other. They catch, they stick, they build up pressure for years or decades, and then they slip all at once. That sudden slip is an earthquake. The collision that built the deepest place on Earth is still happening today, grinding beneath the waves, one of the most seismically active boundaries on the entire planet. But depth and shaking are only part of the story. Something else happens when one plate dives beneath another, something that turns this region into one of the most violent places on Earth in an entirely different way. Rock does not just bend down here, it melts. Follow the diving edge of the Pacific plate as it slides beneath its neighbour, and you follow it down into heat. The deeper the plate sinks into the Earth's mantle, the hotter its surroundings become. Eventually, the descending rock carrying trapped water locked inside its minerals for millions of years reaches temperatures and pressures that force that water out. Water changes everything at that depth. It lowers the melting point of the rock around it, the same way salt lowers the melting point of ice on a winter road. Solid rock that would normally stay solid begins to melt instead, forming pockets of molten material that are lighter than the rock around them. Lighter material rises. It pushes upward through cracks in the crust above, slowly, over thousands of years, until it breaks through the seafloor. That is a volcano. The chain of islands sitting west of the trench, the Mariana Islands, exists because of this exact process. Every island in that chain is a volcano, born from the melted remains of a plate diving into the trench beside it. The trench and the islands are not two separate features sitting near each other by coincidence. They are two halves of the same machine, one side diving down, the other side rising up in fire. This pairing, a deep trench beside a curved line of volcanic islands, happens at subduction zones around the world. Scientists call the whole system an island arc. The Mariana system is one of the most active and well-studied examples on the planet, a place where you can trace the entire path of a tectonic plate from the moment it dives underwater to the moment its melted remains erupt back into the sky. The forces involved are difficult to picture in ordinary terms, so try this instead. Imagine two cars, each the size of a continent, driving toward each other at a speed slower than a fingernail grows, and never stopping. They have been driving toward each other since before dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex existed. They are still driving now, this very second, while you read this sentence, grinding forward at the same relentless pace. This subduction zone produces more earthquakes than almost anywhere else on the planet. Yet strangely, it rarely produces the largest earthquakes we know about, the ones that flatten cities. Scientists studying the region found that the angle at which the Pacific plate dives here is unusually steep, almost vertical in the northern and central sections. That steep angle means the two plates do not press against each other as hard as they do in other subduction zones, so the friction that builds toward massive earthquakes stays lower here than in places like Japan or Chile. Steep or not, the trench keeps deepening, fed by a collision with no plan to stop, and the deeper it goes, the more the ocean above it changes. Sunlight fades first, then warmth disappears. Then the water itself starts pressing down with a weight that reshapes everything living inside it. Drop a coin into a swimming pool and watch it sink. Near the surface, sunlight still reaches it clearly. A few feet down, the light softens. Keep watching as it disappears into deeper water, and eventually you lose sight of it completely, swallowed by water that swallows light the same way a closed curtain swallows a bright room. The ocean does the exact same thing, just on a scale a swimming pool could never match. Sunlight does not travel far through water. Red light, the kind with the longest wavelength, disappears first, absorbed within the first 30 feet. Orange and yellow fade next. Blue and green light travel farthest, which is why tropical water near the surface looks so brilliantly blue. But even blue light gives up eventually. By around 3,000 feet down, every trace of sunlight is gone. Total, permanent darkness begins there and continues all the way to the bottom of every trench on Earth. 3,000 feet is barely a start when the trench itself runs down to nearly 36,000 feet. That means more than 90% of the water column above the Challenger Deep sits in complete blackness, a darkness so total that eyes become almost useless. Many creatures that live at these depths have lost their eyesight entirely over generations, trading vision for other senses that work better in a world with no light at all. Temperature falls right alongside the light. Warm surface water heated by the sun stays near the top because warm water is lighter and floats above colder, denser water below. As you sink deeper, that warmth drains away fast. By the time you reach the bottom of the trench, the water sits at a steady 1 to 4 degrees Celsius, just above freezing, cold enough to numb bare skin within seconds and never warms, never changes with the seasons day after day, year after year, for as long as the trench has existed. Scientists divide the ocean into layers based on how light and temperature change with depth, similar to how Earth's atmosphere splits into layers based on altitude. The sunlit zone near the top holds nearly all ocean life we normally picture. Coral reefs, sea turtles, dolphins, sharks. Below that sits the twilight zone, where light fades to almost nothing. Below that, the midnight zone, permanently dark, where sunlight never reaches at all. Keep dropping past the midnight zone, past 4,000 meters, and you reach something else entirely. A zone so deep, so isolated, so crushing, that scientists named it after the ancient Greek underworld ruled by the god of the dead. They called it the Huddle Zone. It swallows the last 45% of the ocean's total depth range, even though it covers barely 1 or 2% of the entire seafloor. The Huddle Zone is where the Mariana Trench truly begins, and it is where every rule you know about survival starts to break down. Think of the ocean as a 5-story building, except every floor gets more hostile the farther down you go, and there is no elevator backup if something goes wrong. The first floor is called the Sunlit Zone, reaching down to about 200 meters, roughly the height of a 60-story skyscraper. This floor holds almost everything people picture when they imagine the ocean. Coral reefs bursting with color, schools of fish moving like a single silver curtain, whales breaching the surface. Sunlight powers this entire floor, feeding plants and algae that form the base of nearly every food chain here. More than 90% of all known ocean species live on this one floor alone. The second floor is the Twilight Zone, running from 200 meters down to about 1,000. Light still reaches here, but barely, just enough for some creatures to make out shapes and shadows, not enough for plants to grow. Many animals on this floor have giant eyes to catch every scrap of remaining light, or they make their own light instead, glowing blue and green in the gloom through a trick called bioluminescence. The third floor, the Midnight Zone, stretches from 1,000 meters to 4,000. No sunlight survives this deep, not even a trace. Pressure here would already crush an unprotected human body. Creatures on this floor are built strange by necessity. Gelatinous bodies, slow metabolisms, mouths that can swallow prey twice their own size because meals are rare and everyone has to count. The fourth floor is the Abyssal Zone, from 4,000 meters down to 6,000. Nearly 4 miles beneath the surface, this floor sits in freezing pitch-black water where few life forms manage to survive at all. It covers more of Earth's surface than any other single environment on the planet, and yet almost nobody has ever seen it. Then comes the fifth floor, the one this trench calls home. The Hadal Zone begins at 6,000 meters and runs down to 11,000, the deepest habitat that exists anywhere in Earth's oceans. This floor is not smooth or continuous like the others. It exists only in isolated pockets, cut off from each other like separate rooms with no hallway connecting them. formed only where trenches like this one plunge down from the ocean floor above. Why does life crowd so heavily onto that first floor and thin out dramatically with every floor below? Sunlight is the answer. Sunlight drives photosynthesis, and photosynthesis builds the base of almost every food chain on the planet, in the ocean and on land alike. Take away the sunlight, and you take away the easy food. Every floor below the twilight zone survives on scraps, dead creatures drifting down from above, decaying matter called marine snow that falls like a slow, endless blizzard toward the bottom. By the time anything reaches the Hadal zone, most of that falling food has already been eaten, picked apart, and consumed by everything living on the floors above it. Whatever survives the fall to the 5th floor arrives as little more than crumbs, and yet, against every expectation, something down there has learned to live on crumbs, in darkness, under a weight that would flatten steel. Numbers alone cannot explain pressure like this, so try building the picture piece by piece instead. Stand at sea level, and the air above you already presses down with a weight of about 15 pounds on every square inch of your body. You do not feel it because you have never lived without it. Your whole body, your blood, your lungs, evolved under that exact pressure, so it feels like nothing at all, the same way you do not notice the weight of your own clothes after wearing them for an hour. Now go underwater. Water is far denser than air, so pressure builds fast. For every 33 feet you descend, you add another full unit of pressure, another entire sea level's worth of push stacked on top of the last one. Scuba divers start feeling this after only a few dozen feet. Go deeper than about 130 feet, roughly the length of a bowling lane, and recreational diving becomes dangerous even with modern equipment. Keep descending far beyond that, all the way to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and the pressure reaches somewhere between 15 and 16,000 pounds per square inch. That is not just louder pressure, that is a different universe of pressure, over 1,000 times what you feel standing on a beach right now. Picture it this way. Take 50 fully loaded jumbo jets, the same planes that carry hundreds of passengers across oceans, and imagine their entire combined weight balanced on a single point the size of a coin. That is roughly the crushing force pressing on every square inch at the bottom of this trench. Or picture 8 tons, the weight of 2 adult elephants, squeezed onto a patch of skin smaller than your thumbnail. Submarines built to survive military combat, designed to withstand explosions and depth charges, cannot survive a trip to these depths. Their steel hulls would crumple instantly, folding inward faster than the human eye could track the moment. Modern vessels built specifically to reach the trench floor use titanium spheres instead of steel, shaped into a perfect ball because a sphere spreads crushing force evenly across its entire surface, the strongest shape against pressure that engineers have found. Even inside one of these specialized vessels, pilots describe an eerie tension in the air, a low groaning sound from the hull as it flexes under a weight most of us will never come close to experiencing. One wrong weld, one flaw in the metal, and the vessel would implode in a fraction of a second, far too fast for anyone inside to register what happened. And yet this same crushing pressure, the very force that would flatten a warship, is simply home for something living down there, not tolerated, not survived through some desperate struggle. Home in the same easy way that air pressure at sea level is home for you. To understand how anything manages that, we need to look at what pressure actually does to a body, and why yours would fail long before you ever reach the bottom. People often assume the danger of deep water is being crushed flat, bones snapping like twigs under enormous weight. That image is dramatic, but it is not quite how the human body actually fails at extreme depth. The real danger starts somewhere else entirely. The air spaces inside you. Water itself barely compresses. Push on it with enormous force and it barely shrinks in volume, which is part of why creatures built mostly of water, muscle and jelly can survive incredible depths relatively unharmed. But air behaves completely differently. Air compresses easily, shrinking dramatically as pressure rises around it. Your body is full of air spaces, lungs, sinuses, the middle of your ears. At sea level, these spaces sit in balance with the air pressure around you, descend even a short distance underwater without special equipment, and that balance breaks. The deeper you go, the more those air spaces try to shrink, and the tissue around them cannot shrink to match. That mismatch is what divers feel as ear pain during a swimming pool dive, multiplied by 1,000 at Hadal depths. At the pressure found in the Mariana Trench, unprotected lungs would not simply hurt, they would collapse instantly and completely, crushed down to a fraction of their normal size in a fraction of a second. Any human attempting this without a rigid pressure-resistant chamber around them would die before the brain even had time to process pain signals. There would be no slow suffering, no gradual crush, just immediate, total failure. This is exactly why the vessels built to explore this trench use rigid spheres of titanium or steel, holding a bubble of ordinary sea-level air pressure inside no matter how much pressure the outside ocean applies. The people inside never actually feel the crushing force directly. They ride inside a tiny pocket of normal Earth conditions, dropped into the most abnormal environment on the planet. Deep-sea creatures solve this problem in an entirely different way. Instead of fighting pressure with rigid walls like a submarine, most creatures built for extreme depth simply remove air spaces from their bodies altogether. Many deep-sea fish have no swim bladder, the gas-filled organ that helps shallower fish control their buoyancy, because a gas-filled organ would be useless, even dangerous, under pressure this extreme. Instead of resisting the crush, these animals let the ocean's pressure pass straight through their bodies, matched on the inside and the outside, so there is nothing left to crush. That single evolutionary choice, giving up air spaces almost entirely, opens the door to survival at depths that would otherwise kill anything with lungs. But pressure is only the first obstacle facing life down here. Long before any creature adapts to the crush, it first has to reach the bottom of this trench in the first place. For most of human history, nobody could. The first attempt to try changed everything. Long before submersibles carried cameras, sonar, and robotic arms, one strange-looking vessel took on the deepest place on Earth using little more than steel, gasoline, and courage. It was called the Trieste, and it was not built like any submarine you picture today. The Trieste was a bathyscaphe, a type of free-diving vessel, with a design almost as strange as the trench it aimed to explore. Above the crew sat a massive float, filled with gasoline, chosen because gasoline is lighter than water and barely compresses under pressure, giving the vessel buoyancy without needing a rigid heavy tank. Below that float hung a small steel sphere, thick-walled and cramped, built to hold two people and protect them from the crushing water outside. There were no engines strong enough to fight ocean currents on this vessel. There was no way to steer with any real precision. The Trieste simply dropped, controlled almost entirely by dumping ballast weight to slow the descent, and rose the same way, by releasing more weight until it floated back to the surface. It was, in many ways, closer to a controlled fall than a piloted dive. By the late 1950s, the vessel had already been tested at extreme depths, proving the sphere could survive pressures that would destroy conventional submarines. Confidence grew that something as ambitious as the Challenger Deep itself might actually be reachable. Getting there meant trusting a steel ball no larger than a small room to survive the single, greatest crushing force found anywhere on the planet. Every part of that sphere had to be built with almost impossible precision. A single flaw in the steel, a bubble trapped during casting, a tiny crack invisible to the eye, could mean total failure the moment pressure reached its peak. The crew heading toward Challenger Deep knew this. They knew that if the sphere failed at 10,000 meters down, there would be no warning, no chance to react, nothing but instant silence. Despite the risk, preparations moved forward. The Trieste was towed out to the waters above the trench, positioned above the exact spot where the seafloor dropped farther than anywhere else on the planet. Two men climbed inside the sphere, sealed the hatch behind them, and waited as engineers on the surface made final checks. Then the ballast released, and the vessel began to sink. What followed became one of the most extraordinary journeys ever attempted by human beings. A slow fall into total darkness toward a floor no person had ever seen. Nobody knew for certain what waited at the bottom, or whether the sphere would hold. All they could do now was descend and hope the steel around them was strong enough to survive what came next. Inside the Trieste's cramped steel sphere sat Jacques Picard, a Swiss oceanographer, and Don Walsh, a United States Navy officer. Between them and the crushing pressure of the entire Pacific Ocean stood only a few inches of steel and one small window made of thick, specially cast plastic. On January 23, 1960, they began their descent into Challenger Deep. The fall took nearly 5 hours. 5 hours of sinking through total blackness, watching the depth gauge climb past numbers no human vessel had ever reached before. Sunlight disappeared within the first few minutes. After that, there was nothing to see through that small window, except pure, endless dark, broken only by the occasional flash of bioluminescent life drifting past outside. 5 hours is a long time to sit inside a space barely large enough for 2 people, knowing that a single flaw in the steel around you could end everything instantly, with no warning and no chance to react. Picard and Walsh had no way to know for certain what waited below, or whether their vessel could survive contact with the seafloor at a depth that had never been tested by any manned craft in history. Partway through the descent, something happened that could have ended the mission entirely. One of the thick plastic windows on the vessel cracked under the strain of the growing pressure outside. The crack did not break through completely, and the men made the decision to continue rather than abort, trusting the remaining strength of the structure around them. It was a decision made in near total isolation, thousands of meters below any possible rescue, with only each other to consult. They kept sinking. Finally, after nearly 5 hours, the depth gauge read close to 10,900 meters. The Trieste had reached the floor of the Challenger Deep, the lowest point on the surface of planet Earth, a spot no human being had ever touched or seen with their own eyes. Through the small window, lit by the vessel's outside lamps, the 2 men saw the seafloor stretch out below them, a flat, pale expanse of fine sediment. And then, almost impossibly, they saw something moving. A flatfish, resting on the bottom, apparently untroubled by the pressure that would have killed a person almost instantly. That single sighting mattered enormously. Before this dive, some scientists genuinely questioned whether any vertebrate animal, any creature with a backbone, could survive at such extreme depth and pressure. The flatfish Picard and Walsh described proved otherwise in the most direct way possible, with their own eyes at the very bottom of the ocean. They stayed at the bottom for only about 20 minutes before beginning the long rise back to the surface. It would be more than 50 years before anyone attempted a manned dive to this exact spot again. The flatfish that Picard and Walsh reported seeing through their cracked window became one of the most debated sightings in the history of ocean exploration. For decades afterward, scientists argued over what exactly the 2 men had seen at the bottom of the world. Some researchers questioned whether true bony fish, the kind with skeletons built from actual bone rather than cartilage, could physically survive at such extreme pressure at all. Bone is rigid. Rigid structures under crushing pressure behave differently than soft, flexible bodies. If a fish with a hard skeleton really lived at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, it would mean life had found a way around a barrier many assumed was absolute. Later research would complicate the picture even further. As scientists studied fish captured from other extreme hadal depths in the decades that followed, they began to notice something consistent. The deepest living bony fish ever documented did not have heavily calcified, rigid skeletons at all. Instead, they had skeletons that were soft, flexible, almost cartilage-like, built from bone that never fully hardened the way it does in fish living in shallower water. This detail matters enormously. It suggests that surviving at extreme hadal depths is not really about building a stronger, tougher body capable of resisting crushing force head-on. It is about becoming soft enough, flexible enough, that there is nothing rigid left to crush in the first place. Rigid structures fail catastrophically under pressure. Flexible structures simply bend and adjust, passing pressure through rather than fighting against it. Whatever exactly Picard and Walsh saw resting on the seafloor that day, their sighting pointed towards something true about life at extreme depth that later research would confirm again and again. Survival down here does not come from armor. It comes from surrender, at least on a structural level, giving up rigidity in exchange for a body built to flex and yield instead of resist. This idea reshaped how scientists thought about the entire Hadal zone. Instead of picturing the deepest ocean as empty and lifeless, a place too extreme for anything with a backbone to survive, researchers began to suspect it might hold its own specialized community of creatures, uniquely built for conditions found nowhere else on the planet. But confirming that suspicion would take decades, the Trieste's historic dive proved a human-crewed vessel could reach the bottom and return safely. It did not open the door to regular exploration. After January 1960, an extraordinary silence settled over the deepest place on Earth. No human being would return to that exact spot for more than 50 years, even as the questions raised by that single flatfish sighting waited, unanswered, at the bottom of the world. After the Trieste's historic 1960 dive, you might expect a rush of follow-up expeditions, teams of scientists eager to return and study what Picard and Walsh had glimpsed. Instead, the opposite happened. More than 50 years passed before another human being made the journey back down to that exact spot at the bottom of the Challenger Deep. 50 years is longer than most people's entire working lives. It is longer than the time between the first airplane flight and the first human landing on the moon. During that same stretch of decades, humanity built the internet, mapped the human genome, and sent robotic rovers to explore the surface of Mars. Yet the deepest point in our own oceans, just a few miles beneath ships crossing the Pacific every single day, remained essentially untouched. Why the long gap? Part of the answer comes down to sheer difficulty and cost. Building a vessel capable of surviving pressure that intense, reliably, safely, and repeatedly requires extraordinary engineering, extraordinary expense, and extraordinary risk tolerance. The Trieste itself was retired not long after its historic dive, and no immediately available replacement existed with the same capability. There was also, in some ways, less obvious scientific pressure to return. Unmanned technology improved dramatically during those decades. Remotely operated vehicles, robotic submarines controlled from the surface with no human life at risk, became more capable and far more practical for regular scientific study. Sending a robot down carried virtually none of the risk of sending a person, and robots could stay down far longer, gathering more data across many more dives. But something was still missing from robotic exploration alone. Robots could collect samples and take photographs. They could not fully capture the experience of human presence at that depth. The direct observation, the split-second decision-making that a trained human pilot could bring to an environment no camera or sensor array could fully anticipate. Interest in returning to the trench with a human crew began building again in the early 21st century, driven partly by advances in materials science that made new pressure-resistant designs possible, and partly by a renewed hunger for genuine exploration of the last truly unmapped frontier on our own planet. New vessels began to take shape, designed from the ground up to survive repeated trips to Hadal depths, rather than a single historic dive. By 2012, more than half a century after Picard and Walsh's descent, a new expedition prepared to attempt something even the Trieste crew had not, reaching Challenger Deep alone. On March 26, 2012, a Canadian filmmaker climbed into a vertical steel sphere barely large enough to fold his body into a sitting position, sealed himself inside completely alone, and began the long fall toward the bottom of the world. His name was James Cameron, known to most people for directing blockbuster films, but on this day he was attempting something far more dangerous than anything on a movie set. His vessel, called the Deep Sea Challenger, looked nothing like the Trieste from half a century earlier. Instead of a horizontal sphere hanging beneath a massive gasoline float, this new design stood vertically, shaped almost like a torpedo standing on its end, with the pilot's chamber positioned at the bottom. The entire vessel was built from advanced materials designed specifically to survive repeated trips to extreme depth, not just a single historic dive. Cameron made this descent completely alone, the first person ever to attempt a solo journey to the deepest point on Earth. No second crew member to share the decision-making, no one else to notice if something began to go wrong. Just one person, sealed inside a chamber roughly the size of a large refrigerator, dropping through total darkness for roughly 90 minutes before reaching the bottom. He later described the environment at depth using an unexpected word: lunar. The seafloor stretched out flat and pale beneath his lights, nearly featureless in most directions, resembling photographs of the moon's surface more than anything found on land. It was a landscape shaped entirely by pressure, cold and darkness rather than wind, rain, or sunlight, the forces that shape nearly every landscape most people have ever seen. Cameron spent several hours at the bottom, far longer than the 20 minutes Pickard and Walsh managed back in 1960. He used the extra time to collect samples, capture video footage, and study the seafloor directly, gathering data that would help scientists understand this environment more deeply than the historic first dive ever could. This solo dive proved something important beyond the raw achievement of reaching the bottom again. It proved that returning to Challenger Deep was possible with modern engineering, not just as a one-time historic feat, but as something that could become routine science rather than singular adventure. It reopened a door that had been closed for over 50 years. Cameron's dive would not remain the deepest ever recorded for long. Within a few years, another explorer would push even further, breaking Cameron's record and revealing something about the trench floor that nobody, not even the two men who first descended into darkness back in 1960, had ever noticed before. In May 2019, an American explorer and former naval officer named Victor Vescovo climbed into a submersible called the Limiting Factor and pushed past every previous depth record set at Challenger Deep. He reached approximately 10,927 meters below the surface, the deepest confirmed human dive in recorded history at that point. Vescovo was not a career oceanographer. He had made his career in finance and private equity before turning his attention toward extreme exploration, eventually setting his sights on reaching the deepest point in every ocean on Earth, a challenge nobody had ever completed before. Challenger Deep represented the final and most difficult piece of that goal. His submersible, unlike the Trieste or even Cameron's vertical vessel, was built for repeat use, engineered to make the trip down and back multiple times rather than surviving as a singular historic achievement. This mattered enormously for what came next, because it meant researchers could return to the trench again and again, gathering far more data than any single dive could ever provide. During his expedition, Vescovo's dives revealed something that surprised many scientists studying the trench. The seafloor at the bottom was not flat and featureless, the way earlier descriptions had suggested. Instead, his cameras captured a complex landscape of ridges, plains, and subtle geological formations, far more varied and textured than anyone previously realized. Decades of assumptions about a smooth, empty bottom had to be revised. His expedition also documented 4 species new to science during these dives, creatures never before observed or catalogued by researchers. Life at the bottom of the trench, it turned out, was more varied and complex than the handful of earlier sightings had suggested. But not every discovery from Vescovo's historic dives was encouraging. Something else waited on the seafloor at the deepest point on the entire planet, something that had no business being there at all, something that would force scientists to confront an uncomfortable truth about just how far human impact on this planet actually reaches. Nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a place so remote that fewer humans have visited it than have walked on the moon, Victor Vescovo's cameras captured something almost impossible to believe. Resting on the seafloor, among the ridges and plains of the deepest point on Earth, sat a plastic bag. Nearby candy wrappers drifted in the current. Think about the journey that plastic bag had to make. It began somewhere on the surface, likely dropped or blown into the ocean by accident, carried by wind and current across possibly thousands of miles of open water. Eventually it sank, slowly settling downward through the sunlit zone, the twilight zone, the midnight zone, the abyssal zone, all the way down into the Hadal zone, coming to rest in the single most remote and inaccessible environment our planet contains. This discovery landed as a genuine shock to the scientific community, but it was not entirely without precedent. Even before Vescovo's dive, researchers studying sediment and animal life pulled from the Mariana Trench had already begun detecting traces of human-made pollution buried in this supposedly untouched environment. Industrial chemicals, the same kind used in manufacturing and once common in electronics decades ago, had already been found inside creatures living at extreme Hadal depths, chemicals that should have had no reasonable way of reaching a place this remote. Microplastics, tiny fragments of broken down plastic invisible to the naked eye, have also been detected in sediment samples collected from the trench floor. These particles do not need a current strong enough to carry a whole bag. They simply drift downward slowly, over years, following the same basic path as the natural marine snow that feeds life in the deep ocean, settling layer by layer into sediment that has taken thousands of years to build. This raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. If pollution can reach the single most isolated environment on the entire planet, a place separated from human activity by nearly 7 miles of crushing ocean, is there truly anywhere left on Earth that human impact cannot reach? The Mariana Trench was once imagined as a kind of final frontier, untouched and pristine simply by virtue of being so extraordinarily difficult to access. That image no longer holds up against what cameras and sample collectors have actually found down there. Scientists studying this pollution are especially concerned about what it means for the animals living permanently in this environment, creatures that have nowhere else to go and no way to avoid whatever drifts down from the world above them. Whatever we introduce into the ocean, however far away it seems, eventually finds its way down. Despite this pollution, despite the crushing pressure, despite total darkness and near freezing temperatures, life at the bottom of this trench is not just surviving. It is thriving in stranger and more specialized forms than almost anyone expected to find down there. For decades, most descriptions of the Challenger Deep painted a simple picture: a flat, featureless expanse of pale sediment stretching in every direction, about as visually interesting as a desert with the wind smoothed out. Pickard and Walsh's brief 20 minutes at the bottom, viewed through a small cracked window, gave little reason to question that image. Vescovo's repeated dives changed that picture entirely. His cameras revealed a seafloor built from distinct plains and ridges, subtle changes in elevation that split the bottom of the trench into separate zones rather than one continuous flat expanse. Scientists now recognize the Challenger Deep as 3 separate basins, called the Eastern, Western and Central Basins, each formed by the complex folding and faulting that comes from 2 tectonic plates locked in a slow, grinding collision. These basins stretch across a region roughly 25 miles wide, an area larger than many cities, sitting at the absolute bottom of the deepest scar on the planet. Researchers still debate which of the 3 basins holds the single deepest point, with measurements from different expeditions landing within a few meters of each other, a difference so small it barely matters practically but still fascinates scientists trying to pin down the exact record. The sediment covering this landscape tells its own story. Fine, pale, almost powder-like material blankets much of the seafloor, built up slowly over enormous stretches of time from the endless drift of marine snow, tiny particles of dead organic material falling from the sunlit waters far above. This sediment can take thousands of years to accumulate even a modest layer, meaning the seafloor here preserves a slow-motion record of ocean history stretching back much further than written human history itself. Beyond sediment, researchers have also documented signs of underwater landslides, cracks, and small-scale volcanic activity scattered throughout the region, evidence that this landscape is not static or frozen in time. It continues to shift and change, shaped by the same tectonic forces that created the trench in the first place, just moving at a pace too slow for any single human lifetime to notice directly. Understanding the actual shape of this seafloor matters for more than curiosity alone. Different animals prefer different types of terrain, the same way animals on land favour forests, deserts or mountains depending on their needs. A varied seafloor with ridges, plains and cracks can support a far more varied community of life than a single flat, featureless surface ever could. And varied life is exactly what researchers have found waiting down here. Life built in ways so unusual that describing it as merely strange barely does it justice. Total darkness changes everything about how a body gets built. In the sunlit zone near the surface, eyes matter enormously. Sharp vision helps a fish spot predators, find food, and navigate through a world lit by the sun. But 6,000 meters down in the Hadal zone, sunlight has never once touched the water. It never will. Down here, An eye built for seeing light is an eye built for nothing at all. Evolution does not keep expensive features around once they stop earning their cost. Building and maintaining a complex working eye takes real energy an animal could spend elsewhere instead, on muscle, on reproduction, on simply surviving another week in a place where food arrives as rare scraps drifting down from far above. Generation after generation, in an environment with zero light to see, animals that spent less energy on eyesight had a small advantage over animals that spent more. Over millions of years, that small advantage adds up. Many creatures living permanently in the Hadal zone have lost meaningful eyesight almost entirely. Some retain small, simplified eye structures that can barely detect the faintest shift between total darkness and slightly less total darkness. Others have genes tied to vision that have mutated into a non-functional state, still present in their genetic code but no longer doing the job vision once did. Losing pigmentation follows a similar logic. Bright colours and patterns exist in nature mostly for one of two reasons: to attract a mate under visible light, or to blend into a visible background and hide from predators that can see you. Neither reason applies in permanent darkness. Many Hadal creatures are pale, translucent, or almost ghostly white, not because paleness helps them survive, but because colour simply stopped mattering once nothing down here could see it anyway. So how does anything find food, avoid danger, or locate a mate without sight in a place this dark? The answer lies in senses most humans barely think about. Many deep-sea creatures rely heavily on detecting subtle vibrations and pressure changes in the water around them, essentially feeling their surroundings rather than seeing them. Others use chemical signals, tasting or smelling the water for traces of nearby food or other animals, building a picture of their world through chemistry instead of a light. Some creatures take an entirely different approach. Instead of giving up on light altogether, they make their own. Bioluminescence, the ability to produce a soft biological glow, appears throughout many levels of the deep ocean, used to lure prey close, startle predators, or signal to potential mates across the darkness. But down at the very bottom, past even the reach of most bioluminescent creatures, one particular animal represents the absolute edge of what a vertebrate body can survive. It has no bones in the way you would recognize them. It looks almost like a ghost, and it holds the record for the deepest living fish ever found on Earth. Meet the Hadal snailfish, a creature that looks like it should not exist, and yet holds the title of deepest living vertebrate ever recorded on the entire planet. Picture something roughly the size of a pen, pale and almost see-through, with a soft, gelatinous body that looks closer to a jellyfish than to any fish you have ever caught or eaten. This is not weakness. This is precision engineering, shaped by roughly 18 million years of evolution inside one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Most fish rely on a swim bladder, a small gas-filled organ that helps control buoyancy, letting them float at a chosen depth without constantly swimming. At extreme Hadal pressure, a gas-filled organ becomes a serious liability rather than a helpful tool, since gas compresses dramatically under pressure this intense. So somewhere along its evolutionary path, the Hadal snailfish lost its swim bladder completely. In its place, the fish relies on a body made mostly of gelatinous tissue, less dense than muscle and bone, giving it just enough natural buoyancy to stay balanced in the water column without any gas involved at all. Its skeleton follows the same basic strategy. Rather than hardening into rigid, heavily calcified bone the way most fish skeletons do, the Hadal snailfish keeps much of its skeleton soft and flexible, closer to cartilage than true bone. A rigid skeleton resists pressure directly, fighting against the crush. A soft, flexible skeleton bends instead, letting pressure pass through the body rather than battling against it. The same basic principle that let flexible marine life survive depths that would destroy anything built rigid and strong. Inside its cells, this fish relies on a special molecule to protect its proteins from collapsing under crushing pressure, a chemical trick shared with other deep-sea survivors that keeps its inner machinery working normally, even while the water outside presses down with a force equal to more than 1,000 times what you feel standing on solid ground. Despite its fragile appearance, the Hadal snailfish is not some passive drifter waiting to be eaten. It is considered one of the top predators in its entire habitat, hunting small crustaceans called amphipods that scavenge along the trench floor. Hidden inside its throat sits a second set of jaws, a hidden weapon that snaps shut on prey after the first bite pulls it inward, an adaptation that gives this soft, delicate-looking animal a surprisingly effective way to catch and hold onto a meal in a place where meals do not come around often. Scientists have recorded these fish living at depths beyond 8,000 meters, deeper than almost any other vertebrate has ever been confirmed to survive, and the molecule protecting its proteins from collapsing under all that pressure is not unique to this one species. Similar chemistry shows up again and again throughout the deepest parts of the ocean, in wildly different creatures that never even encounter each other, hinting at something remarkable about how life keeps arriving at the exact same solution to survive the same impossible place. Look inside the mouth of a Hadal snailfish, and at first glance you see nothing unusual. A simple opening, softer lips, no visible teeth to worry about. Look closer, deep in the back of its throat, and you find something that sounds like it belongs in a nightmare rather than a real animal. A second set of jaws, hidden and ready. This structure is called a pharyngeal jaw, and while it sounds bizarre, it is not unique to deep sea monsters. Several groups of fish living in shallower, more familiar waters carry a similar feature, an extra set of jaw-like bones positioned in the throat rather than the mouth. What makes the Hadal snailfish's version so important is what it reveals about survival at extreme depth, where every single meal counts. Here is why that second jaw matters so much. Food in the Hadal zone is scarce. Nothing grows down here through photosynthesis, since sunlight never reaches this deep. Every calorie available to a Hadal snailfish either drifts down from far above as decaying scraps, or comes from actively hunting the small crustaceans that scavenge along the trench floor. When you might go a long stretch of time between meals, you cannot afford to let prey escape once you finally catch it. The first bite from the fish's outer mouth grabs hold of prey. Then the second set of jaws, waiting deeper in the throat, clamps down and pulls that prey further inward, crushing and securing it before it has any real chance to wriggle free. It works almost like a second line of defense against a meal slipping away, doubling the odds that a successful catch actually turns into a successful meal. This hunting strategy pairs with another surprising trait found in these fish: unusually large, roomy stomachs relative to their overall body size. Since meals arrive unpredictably and food might stay scarce for long stretches, a bigger stomach lets a Hadal snailfish eat as much as possible whenever the rare opportunity arises, storing extra energy for the lean periods that inevitably follow. Put these pieces together, and you get a fish built entirely around uncertainty. It cannot count on food showing up on any kind of predictable schedule, the way animals nearer the surface often can, so its body developed to make the absolute most of every chance encounter with prey. Multiple jaws to guarantee the catch, an oversized stomach to store the reward, and a slow, careful movement style that conserves energy between opportunities. Despite its gelatinous, almost fragile-looking body, the Hadal snailfish sits near the top of the food chain in its own extreme habitat. It is not the biggest predator in the ocean by any measure, but in a world this harsh, being the biggest is not what matters. What matters is not wasting a single opportunity, and this small, jelly-bodied fish has built its entire existence around exactly that principle. Every living cell depends on tiny molecular machines called proteins, folded into precise three-dimensional shapes that let them do their jobs correctly. Enzymes that break down food, structures that hold cells together, signals that carry messages through the body, nearly all of it depends on proteins keeping their exact folded shape. Change that shape even slightly, and the protein often stops working entirely. Extreme pressure threatens exactly that. At depths found in the Hadal zone, crushing force pushes on proteins hard enough to distort their folded structure, squeezing water molecules out of the tiny gaps within a protein's shape and forcing the whole structure to warp. A distorted protein is often a broken protein, unable to perform whatever task it evolved to do. This should be a fatal problem for any creature attempting to live at these depths, and for most life on Earth, it is. But animals that thrive in the Hadal zone have found a clever chemical workaround built around a compound called trimethylamine N oxide. usually shortened to TMAO. TMAO works almost like a molecular bodyguard. It accumulates inside the cells of deep-sea creatures, and once there, it counteracts the distorting effect that pressure has on proteins, helping them hold their correct folded shape, even while crushing force pushes in from every direction. Essentially, TMAO stabilizes the protein from the inside just as pressure tries to destabilize it from the outside. A constant tug-of-war happening at the molecular level inside every single cell. Researchers have found a striking pattern when they measure TMAO levels across fish living at different ocean depths. As depth increases, TMAO concentration tends to rise right along with it, almost like a dial turning up in direct response to increasing pressure. Fish living near the surface carry very little. Fish living several thousand meters down carry noticeably more. It is one of the clearest chemical fingerprints of adaptation to pressure that scientists have ever documented in nature. Interestingly, recent research studying fish from the very deepest Hadal trenches found something unexpected. TMAO levels did not keep climbing indefinitely below a certain depth, staying relatively steady rather than continuing to rise sharply. This surprised scientists who assumed the trend would hold in a straight line all the way to the bottom, and it suggests that fish living at the absolute extreme of Hadal depth may rely on additional protective strategies beyond TMAO alone, strategies researchers are still working to fully understand. What makes this molecule especially fascinating is how widespread it is. TMAO is not some rare exotic chemical, found only in one bizarre species. It shows up again and again throughout completely different groups of deep-sea creatures, in fish, in crustaceans, in animals that never encounter each other and evolved their pressure defenses on entirely separate paths. That pattern, the same solution appearing independently in creatures with no shared recent ancestry, hints at something even stranger. It suggests evolution may only have a small handful of real options when it comes to surviving pressure this extreme, and different creatures facing the exact same crushing problem keep arriving at remarkably similar answers. For most of scientific history, nobody knew exactly how deep a fish could actually survive. Every new expedition into Hadal trenches carried the possibility of rewriting that number, and in recent years that number has been rewritten again and again, faster than almost anyone expected. In April 2017, researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences reported logging a snailfish at a depth of about 8,152 meters in the Mariana Trench, an extraordinary record at the time. Just a few months later, in August of that same year, a separate research effort recorded a Mariana snailfish slightly deeper still, at roughly 8,178 meters, again within the Mariana Trench itself. Two record-breaking sightings, within months of each other, in the same stretch of ocean. You might expect a record like that to hold for years afterward. Instead, scientists studying a different trench entirely, the Izuogasawara Trench near Japan, filmed a snailfish at 8,336 meters, breaking the previous record by over 150 meters. This was captured on camera, not just measured through indirect sampling, giving researchers direct visual confirmation of a fish living deeper than any vertebrate had ever been recorded before. Then, in a joint expedition in August 2022, researchers working across two neighbouring trenches pushed the boundary even further. They filmed a snailfish and separately captured two physical specimens at a depth of 8,022 meters in the Japan Trench, marking the deepest fish ever physically captured by scientists, a milestone different from simply spotting one on camera. Why does the record keep climbing so quickly? Part of the answer is simply that scientists keep looking harder, with better cameras, better landers, and more frequent expeditions into trenches that had barely been explored before. Every new expedition into a previously unstudied Hadal Trench carries a real chance of finding something living slightly deeper than anything documented before. But there is likely a genuine physical limit somewhere down there too, a depth beyond which even the most specialized pressure-adapted fish simply cannot survive, no matter how much TMAO accumulates in its cells or how flexible its skeleton becomes. Researchers studying this question believe that limits sit somewhere around 8,200 to 8,400 meters, based on how the chemistry protecting protein seems to behave as pressure continues climbing beyond that zone. If that estimate holds true, It means fish as a group may be approaching the outer edge of what their particular biology can handle, a wall built not by lack of exploration but by the basic chemistry of what a vertebrate body can survive. Below that wall, vertebrates may simply run out of tricks, but fish are far from the only animals living at extreme hadal depth. Push past the point where vertebrate life reaches its limit, and an entirely different category of creature takes over completely. Beyond the depth where fish begin to disappear, a different kind of animal dominates the hadal zone almost completely. Amphipods, small shrimp-like crustaceans that have become some of the most successful and abundant creatures living at the very bottom of ocean trenches anywhere on the planet. Most amphipods are tiny, easily overlooked, similar in size to something you might find in a handful of beach sand. But in the extreme isolation of the hadal zone, some species have grown dramatically larger than their shallow water relatives, a phenomenon researchers call deep-sea gigantism. Certain hadal amphipods reach sizes up to a foot long, dwarfing typical amphipods found in coastal waters by an enormous margin. Why would isolation and extreme depth push some creatures toward larger bodies rather than smaller ones? Scientists still debate the exact reasons, but leading explanations point toward the extreme cold-slowing metabolism dramatically, allowing for slower, longer growth over an amphipod's lifetime, combined with reduced competition and fewer predators in such an isolated environment, both of which can favour larger body size over many generations. These oversized amphipods function as the trench's primary scavengers, patrolling the seafloor and consuming whatever organic material happens to drift down and settle there. Dead fish, decaying plant material, wood fragments that somehow sank all the way from the surface, even, as researchers have unfortunately confirmed, fragments of human plastic waste. Amphipods will eat almost anything remotely organic that reaches the trench floor, making them essential recyclers in an environment where waste rarely goes anywhere else. Amphipods gather in massive swarms wherever food happens to appear, sometimes numbering in the thousands around a single carcass or foodful. Researchers studying the hadal zone often use baited traps, specifically because amphipods respond so quickly and in such overwhelming numbers, drawn from surrounding darkness the moment a scent trail reaches them. Inside their bodies, amphipods carry some of the same basic survival tools found in hadal snailfish, including protective molecules that stabilize proteins under crushing pressure. But amphipods also host something scientists have found genuinely fascinating: specialized bacteria living inside their digestive systems, apparently helping boost their metabolism and support survival under the extreme pressure of their environment, almost like an internal team of chemical assistants working alongside their own biology. This partnership between amphipod and bacteria hints at a much bigger pattern scientists are only beginning to fully understand. Throughout the hadal zone, survival rarely comes down to a single creature's biology working entirely alone. Again and again, researchers keep finding partnerships, one organism relying on another, chains of dependence stretching between species that never encounter sunlight, never encounter surface life, and yet still manage to build something resembling an entire working ecosystem in total darkness. Step back from the individual creatures for a moment and look at the trench floor as a whole system, and a different picture starts to emerge. Beneath the amphipods, beneath the snailfish, an enormous, largely invisible workforce of bacteria carpets much of the seafloor, quietly running what amounts to the trench's own recycling plant. Every piece of organic material that reaches the hadal zone, whether it is a dead fish, a scrap of drifting marine snow, or waste left behind by larger animals, eventually needs to be broken down. Bacteria handle most of that job. They decompose dead material, releasing nutrients locked inside it back into the surrounding water and sediment, nutrients that other organisms can then use to survive and grow. This process matters enormously in an environment as starved for food as the hadal zone. Without bacteria constantly breaking down and recycling whatever organic material arrives, nutrients would simply pile up unused, locked inside material too complex for other creatures to access directly. Bacteria essentially unlock the trench's limited food supply, converting raw scraps into forms other life can actually use. Recent expeditions studying the Mariana Trench have revealed the scale of this bacterial world is far larger than anyone previously suspected. One major research effort added more than 6,000 newly identified microbial species to the scientific record, collected from sediment samples across the Hadal Zone, a staggering number that suggests scientists have only begun cataloguing the true diversity hiding in this environment. Some of these microbes have developed genuinely novel biological tricks to survive the crushing pressure of their surroundings, adaptations different from anything found in surface-dwelling bacteria. Researchers studying this microbial community found evidence of specialized proteins and cellular mechanisms that help these organisms function normally under conditions that would destroy bacteria adapted to life near the surface. Why does any of this matter beyond simple curiosity about an obscure corner of the ocean? These bacteria are not just cleaning up scraps. Their unique biology, shaped by hundreds of millions of years of adaptation to extreme pressure, cold, and darkness, represents an enormous and largely untapped source of new biological knowledge. Some pressure-resistant proteins identified in Hadal organisms are already being studied for potential use in medicine and industrial manufacturing, offering possibilities that simply do not exist among bacteria living in ordinary, less extreme environments. The Hadal Zone, once imagined as nearly empty and lifeless, turns out to host an enormous invisible workforce, breaking down waste and cycling nutrients in one of the most efficient, if slow, recycling systems found anywhere on the planet. And this bacterial carpet is not the strangest food source found at the bottom of this trench. In certain isolated spots, an entirely different kind of ecosystem exists, one that does not depend on sunlight, scraps, or recycling at all. Nearly every food chain on Earth traces back to sunlight in some way. Plants capture sunlight through photosynthesis. Animals eat plants. Other animals eat those animals. And the whole system runs on energy that originally came from our sun, 93 million miles away. In the Hadal Zone, where sunlight has never once penetrated, you might assume every scrap of food ultimately traces back to that same distant sunlight, drifting down from the world above as marine snow. Mostly, that assumption holds true. But scattered throughout the wider Mariana region, in specific isolated spots tied to the same volcanic activity that built the trench itself, an entirely different kind of ecosystem exists, one that owes nothing to the sun at all. These spots are called hydrothermal vents, cracks in the seafloor where superheated water and volcanic gases escape directly from deep within the earth. Water flowing out of these vents can reach temperatures well above the boiling point at sea level, roaring out into surrounding seawater that sits just a few degrees above freezing. The contrast is almost impossible to picture. Scalding, mineral-rich water erupting directly into some of the coldest, darkest water found anywhere on the planet, all within the span of a few feet. Inside that scalding water hides something remarkable. Dissolved chemicals, particularly hydrogen sulfide, the same compound responsible for the smell of the rotten eggs, carried up from deep within the Earth's crust. To most animals, hydrogen sulfide is toxic, but certain specialized bacteria have evolved the ability to use it as an energy source instead, through a process called chemosynthesis. Chemosynthesis works similarly to photosynthesis in one important way. Both processes let an organism build usable energy out of raw materials in its environment. But where photosynthesis relies on capturing sunlight, chemosynthesis relies on capturing energy locked inside chemical bonds, breaking down compounds like hydrogen sulfide, and using the released energy to build sugars and other nutrients from scratch. No sunlight required at any step of the process. This chemical trick means hydrothermal vent bacteria can build an entire food chain independent of the sun completely, something almost nowhere else on the surface of our planet manages to accomplish. Around these vents, dense colonies of specialized bacteria form thick microbial mats, providing food for a whole community of animals that gather nowhere else in the surrounding trench, drawn specifically to these isolated pockets of chemical energy rising from below. The first hydrothermal vent ecosystem was discovered by scientists studying an entirely different part of the ocean, and the discovery reshaped how biologists thought about the basic requirements for life anywhere. Sunlight, long assumed to be essential for any thriving ecosystem, turned out not to be strictly necessary after all. Somewhere in the volcanic cracks feeding the Mariana system, that same principle plays out again, supporting communities of animals unlike anything found drifting through the open trench nearby. Among the strangest residents clustered around chemosynthetic environments near the Mariana system are tube worms, animals so unusual in their basic biology that they force scientists to rethink assumptions about how a living creature could even function. An adult tube worm has no mouth, it has no stomach, it has no digestive system at all in any form you would recognize from ordinary animals, and yet it grows, survives, and thrives for years, sometimes housed inside protective tubes it builds and anchors directly onto the seafloor near a source of chemical-rich fluid. How does an animal survive with no way to eat? The answer lies inside its own body, in a specialized internal organ packed with billions of the same kind of chemosynthetic bacteria found in the mats scattered across nearby vents. Rather than eating food directly, a tube worm essentially farms bacteria inside its own tissue, providing them a safe, stable home in exchange for the nutrients those bacteria produce through chemosynthesis. The tube worm's role in this partnership involves specialized blood, coloured a vivid, almost startling red, capable of absorbing both oxygen and hydrogen sulfide from the surrounding water and safely transporting both directly to the bacteria living inside its tissue. This matters because hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most animal cells directly, so the tube worm has to carefully deliver this chemical to its bacterial partners without poisoning its own body in the process, a delicate biological balancing act few other creatures ever need to manage. In exchange for this steady supply of raw material, the bacteria produce nutrients the tube worm needs to survive and grow, effectively turning the worm's body into a living chemical factory built entirely around a partnership rather than direct feeding. Neither organism could easily survive alone in this environment. The bacteria need a stable, protected home near the vent's chemical output. The tube worm needs the nutrients its bacterial partners produce. Together they form a single functioning unit built from two entirely separate species. Recent expeditions studying chemosynthetic communities near the Mariana Trench have documented thousands of tube worms clustered together at depths, pushing past 9,000 meters, forming what researchers described as a dense, thriving colony, far larger and more extensive than anyone previously expected to find at such extreme depth. Alongside the tube worms, researchers also documented large populations of bivalves, a type of shellfish, clustered thickly enough in some areas to blanket long stretches of the seafloor almost completely. This discovery matters far beyond simple curiosity about strange biology. It suggests that chemosynthesis-based communities, once assumed to be rare, isolated exceptions scattered occasionally throughout the deep ocean, might actually be far more widespread than scientists previously believed, hidden throughout similar trenches around the world that have simply never been explored closely enough to find them. If true, it means the Hadal Zone as a whole holds far more life and far more of these strange sunlight-independent ecosystems than anyone had any reason to expect only a few years ago. Step away from the dramatic tube worms and giant amphipods for a moment and consider the sheer scale of what remains almost completely unknown at the bottom of this trench, the microscopic world made up of organisms so small that entire new species can hide undiscovered in a single scoop of sediment. A major research effort focused specifically on the Mariana Trench and nearby Hadal zones set out to catalogue this hidden microbial world in detail, collecting sediment samples from some of the most extreme and inaccessible depths on the planet. The results were staggering. Researchers identified more than 6,000 microbial species entirely new to science, added to the scientific record in a single, coordinated research push, a number that dwarfs what most researchers expected going into the project. Think about what that number actually represents. Each of those 6,000 species carries its own unique genetic code, its own specific adaptations for surviving extreme pressure, near-freezing temperatures, and permanent darkness. Each one potentially holds biological tricks that have never been documented anywhere else on Earth, hidden inside an environment so remote that almost nobody has ever bothered or been able to look closely. This research effort did not stop at simply counting new species. Scientists also sequenced genetic material from these microbes, searching for the specific biological mechanisms that let them survive conditions lethal to nearly everything else. Some of these mechanisms involve specialized proteins that remain stable and functional under crushing pressure, protecting essential cellular machinery from the kind of structural collapse that would destroy proteins in a typical surface-dwelling organism. Researchers studying this microbial community have pointed toward genuinely practical reasons to care about these discoveries beyond pure scientific curiosity. Pressure-resistant proteins and enzymes, refined over millions of years of extreme adaptation, could eventually inform new approaches in medicine, helping researchers develop more stable drugs or treatments. Similar principles could apply to industrial manufacturing, where stable, resilient enzymes are often valuable tools for breaking down or building specific materials efficiently. There is something almost humbling about a discovery like this. Humanity has mapped the surface of Mars in remarkable detail. We have photographed galaxies billions of light years away. Yet right here on our own planet, in a trench, a few miles beneath ships crossing the Pacific Ocean, thousands of species were sitting completely unknown and unnamed until researchers finally looked closely enough to find them. And this discovery points toward an uncomfortable truth as well. If an entire hidden world of microscopic life managed to stay completely undocumented until now, it raises a serious question about what else might already be quietly disappearing down there, threatened by human activity before scientists even get the chance to properly study it in the first place. Sometimes the most striking discoveries in science come not from finding something entirely new, but from finding the exact same thing showing up in places it has no obvious reason to appear. That is exactly what happened when researchers compared the genetic code of deep sea fish, collected from completely separate ocean trenches on opposite sides of the world. Scientists analysed genetic material from fish living in extreme deep sea environments, including populations sampled from the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean and from separate trenches located in the Indian Ocean, environments separated by enormous distances, with no realistic possibility of these fish populations ever mixing or directly influencing each other's evolution. Despite that separation, despite evolving on completely independent timelines, sometimes across very different periods of evolutionary history, these fish populations had developed the exact same specific genetic mutation, a change linked directly to surviving extreme deep-sea conditions. This kind of pattern has a name in evolutionary biology: convergent evolution. It describes situations where different species, facing a similar environmental challenge, independently evolve remarkably similar solutions, without inheriting that solution from a shared recent ancestor. Wings evolving separately in birds, bats, and insects offer one familiar example of this same broader pattern, playing out on a much more visible scale. Finding convergent evolution at the level of a single specific mutation, rather than a broader physical feature like wings, is a much rarer and more striking discovery. It suggests something deeper than simple coincidence. When researchers see the same, precise genetic solution appearing independently in unrelated populations facing the same specific pressure-related challenge, it hints that evolution may have found something close to the single best possible answer to that particular problem, an answer so effective that multiple separate lineages independently arrived at it, rather than finding several different but equally functional alternatives. Researchers studying this pattern also noted something more troubling alongside the shared mutation itself. Their broader investigation detected industrial chemical pollutants inside fish tissue and in surrounding sediment collected from these same extreme deep-sea trenches, chemicals with no natural source, confirming once again that human industrial activity has already reached environments once assumed to be entirely beyond our influence. Put together, this research paints a genuinely striking picture. On one hand, it reveals something remarkable about the underlying rules of evolution itself, rules powerful and consistent enough to produce identical genetic solutions in creatures separated by entire oceans and enormous stretches of time. On the other hand, it reveals that even this ancient independently evolved biological solution now exists inside bodies already carrying traces of modern human industrial waste. A collision between deep evolutionary history and recent human impact happening inside the exact same fish. The trench, it turns out, is not some sealed-off vault, isolated from everything happening in the world above it. Whatever happens on the surface eventually finds its way down, no matter how many miles of crushing water stand in between. Pollution reaching the Mariana Trench is not a single, isolated incident involving one unlucky plastic bag caught on camera. Multiple independent research efforts, using different methods and studying different types of samples, have all confirmed the same unsettling pattern. human-made pollution has already established a lasting presence in the single most remote environment on the entire planet. Beyond the industrial chemical pollutants detected in deep-sea fish tissue, researchers studying amphipods collected directly from the trench floor have found similarly troubling results. Persistent organic pollutants, a category of manufactured chemicals once widely used in electronics and industrial processes decades ago, have turned up inside the bodies of these small crustaceans at levels that genuinely surprised researchers, given how remote and inaccessible their habitat truly is. Some of these specific chemicals were banned for use decades ago in many parts of the world, precisely because of how persistent and harmful they can be. Yet traces of them continue circulating through global ocean currents, slowly settling downward through every layer of the ocean, eventually reaching sediment and animal tissue at the very bottom of the deepest trench on the planet. Proof that a chemical ban does not necessarily mean a chemical actually disappears from the environment. Microplastics represent another significant and growing source of contamination. These tiny plastic fragments, often smaller than a grain of rice, break down from larger plastic waste through sunlight exposure, wave action, and general wear over time. Unlike a single plastic bag, which needs a strong enough current to physically carry it downward, microplastics can drift far more easily, settling slowly through the water column alongside the same natural marine snow that provides food to deep-sea creatures throughout the entire ocean. This creates a genuinely troubling problem for animals living in the Hadal zone. Many creatures down here filter feed or scavenge whatever organic material happens to drift past them, unable to distinguish naturally occurring food particles from human-made plastic fragments mixed in alongside it. Animals may end up accidentally consuming microplastics directly, mistaking them for real food in an environment already desperately short on nutrition to begin with. Why does pollution reach a place this extraordinarily remote in the first place? Ocean currents move constantly, circulating water and everything suspended within that water across enormous distances over time. Trenches, positioned at the lowest points in the entire ocean basin, naturally act almost like a drain, collecting whatever slowly sinks downward from the vast expanse of ocean above them, concentrating material in one relatively small, low-lying area over long stretches of time. Scientists studying this problem generally agree on one central point. The Mariana Trench can no longer reasonably be considered a pristine, untouched environment, separate and protected from broader human impact simply because it sits so far beyond normal human reach. Human industrial activity has already left a measurable mark on the deepest, most isolated place our planet actually contains. Pollution tells one troubling side of humanity's relationship with the Mariana Trench. But there is another side entirely, one built around genuine scientific opportunity rather than environmental damage, hidden inside the exact same extreme biology that lets creatures survive crushing pressure, freezing cold, and total darkness in the first place. Every adaptation that lets a Hadal creature survive its brutal environment represents millions of years of evolutionary problem-solving, refined and tested under conditions far more extreme than almost anything researchers can easily recreate in a laboratory. Proteins stable enough to resist collapsing under 1,000 times normal atmospheric pressure. Enzymes that continue functioning normally in near-freezing temperatures where most ordinary biological processes would slow to a crawl or stop completely. These are not small, incremental biological tweaks. They represent genuinely extreme solutions to genuinely extreme problems. Researchers studying microbes collected from Hadal sediment have already identified specific proteins with unusual pressure-resistant properties, structures that maintain their correct shape and function under conditions that would cause equivalent proteins from surface-dwelling organisms to collapse entirely. Scientists studying these molecules see real potential for applications reaching far beyond simple curiosity about deep-sea biology. Consider medicine as one clear example. Many modern drugs rely on proteins or enzymes that must remain stable and functional under specific conditions, whether inside the human body, during manufacturing, or through storage and transport before ever reaching a patient. A naturally pressure-resistant protein, discovered inside an organism that has already solved the stability problem through millions of years of extreme evolutionary pressure, could potentially inform the design of more stable, more effective pharmaceutical products. Industrial manufacturing offers another promising direction entirely, Certain manufacturing processes rely heavily on enzymes to break down or build specific materials efficiently, and enzymes that remain stable and active under extreme pressure or temperature conditions could make certain industrial processes significantly more efficient or reliable than current alternatives allow. There is even research interest connecting deep sea biology directly to future space exploration efforts. Life adapted to survive extreme pressure, extreme cold, and complete darkness here on Earth offers scientists a genuinely useful model for thinking about what kind of life might be capable of surviving in similarly extreme conditions found elsewhere in our solar system, particularly on icy moons hiding deep, dark oceans beneath their frozen surfaces. This dual nature of the Hadal Zone captures something important about the trench as a whole. It holds genuine, tangible value for humanity, hidden inside strange and extreme biology that took hundreds of millions of years to develop through relentless evolutionary pressure. And at the very same time, human activity is actively damaging and contaminating that same irreplaceable resource, often before scientists even get the opportunity to properly study or understand what exactly is being lost in the process. Scientists searching for life beyond Earth face an enormous practical challenge. Nobody has ever directly observed truly alien life, so researchers have no confirmed example to study except the life that already exists right here on our own planet. That makes environments like the Mariana Trench unexpectedly valuable, not just as a location worth studying for its own sake, but as a genuine working model for understanding what extreme, non-Earth-like life might actually require to survive elsewhere in the universe. For decades, scientists searching for life on other worlds focused heavily on finding liquid water and reasonably moderate surface temperatures, conditions similar to what supports familiar life here on Earth's surface. But the Hadal Zone challenges that entire framework directly. Down here, sunlight never arrives, temperatures hover just above freezing, and pressure would instantly kill nearly anything adapted to surface conditions. Yet despite every one of those obstacles, life clearly thrives. This matters enormously for a very specific reason connected to other worlds in our own solar system. Several moons orbiting Jupiter and Saturn, including Europa and Enceladus, are now believed to hide enormous oceans of liquid water beneath thick shells of frozen ice covering their surfaces. These hidden oceans never see sunlight either, sealed away permanently beneath miles of solid ice, remarkably similar in that specific respect to the permanent darkness found throughout Earth's own Hadal Zone. If life can find a way to survive without sunlight here on Earth, building entire ecosystems around chemical energy instead through the process of chemosynthesis, then the same basic principle could theoretically apply to a hidden ocean world like Europa as well. Life there, if it exists at all, would likely need to rely on a similar strategy, drawing energy from chemical reactions rather than depending on sunlight that could never realistically reach that deep beneath solid ice. Researchers studying hydrothermal vents and chemosynthetic communities near the Mariana Trench are essentially studying a working real-world example of exactly this kind of sunlight-independent ecosystem, one that already exists and functions successfully, rather than remaining purely theoretical. Every new detail learned about how tube worms, bacteria, and other chemosynthetic organisms manage to survive and thrive down here helps refine scientific predictions about what similar life elsewhere in the universe might actually require, and what specific signs future space missions should realistically be searching for. Beyond chemosynthesis specifically, the broader biological adaptations found throughout the Hadal Zone, extreme pressure-resistant proteins, unusual approaches to buoyancy and skeletal structure, complete independence from any need for eyesight, all help scientists build a much more complete and realistic picture of the full range of conditions life can actually adapt to and survive within. In a very real sense, learning to understand the deepest, darkest corner of our own planet has become an essential and unexpectedly practical step in humanity's much broader search for life somewhere else entirely, one that may ultimately point us toward oceans far beyond our own. The Mariana Trench does not sit quietly at the bottom of the ocean, patiently waiting to be explored. It sits directly on top of one of the most seismically active regions found anywhere on the entire planet, a place where two massive tectonic plates remain locked in constant grinding collision. a collision that occasionally releases its built-up tension in sudden, powerful bursts. Subduction zones like this one are responsible for the vast majority of all earthquakes recorded on Earth. As one plate slowly forces itself beneath another, the two surfaces do not slide past each other smoothly or continuously. Instead, they catch and stick together in places, held in place by friction, while stress steadily builds up underneath, sometimes over years or even decades of accumulated pressure. Eventually that stress overcomes the friction holding the plates together, and they slip suddenly, releasing enormous amounts of built-up energy all at once. That sudden release is what we experience on the surface as an earthquake. The Mariana subduction zone produces earthquakes on a genuinely regular basis, a direct and constant reminder that this trench is not some fixed, unchanging geological feature frozen permanently in place. It is an active, ongoing collision between two enormous slabs of Earth's crust, still shaping and reshaping the seafloor today, in real time, even as you read this sentence. Interestingly, despite how consistently active this particular subduction zone is, it rarely produces the kind of truly massive, catastrophic earthquakes that have struck other subduction zones around the world, such as the ones responsible for major historic disasters in places like Japan or Chile. Researchers studying this pattern point toward the unusually steep angle at which the Pacific Plate dives beneath its neighbour here, especially in the northern and central sections of the trench. That steep angle appears to reduce the overall friction and direct pressure building up between the two plates, lowering the odds of a single, massive earthquake compared to subduction zones where the plates press against each other at a shallower, more direct angle. Beyond earthquakes alone, this same tectonic activity also drives ongoing volcanic activity throughout the wider region, feeding the chain of Mariana Islands positioned just west of the trench and fueling many of the hydrothermal vents scattered throughout the broader Mariana system. Earthquakes, volcanoes, and hydrothermal vents are not separate, unrelated phenomena happening to occur near each other by pure coincidence. They are different visible symptoms of the exact same underlying tectonic collision, driving nearly everything geologically significant happening throughout this entire region. For animals living permanently within the trench itself, this constant underlying seismic activity is simply a normal, unremarkable part of their everyday environment, background noise woven directly into the fabric of their world in the same basic way that weather shapes conditions for animals living on the surface far above them. The ground beneath their world never stops moving, however slowly and however imperceptibly to anything without sensitive instruments designed specifically to detect it. Here is a fact that surprises most people the first time they hear it clearly stated. Humanity has mapped the surface of the Moon, and Mars and even Venus in remarkably fine detail. Yet the vast majority of our own ocean floor, right here on the planet we actually live on, remains essentially unmapped and unexplored in any real detail at all. Current estimates suggest that only a small fraction of the entire global seafloor has been mapped, with the kind of high-resolution detail that scientists consider genuinely useful for serious research. The rest exists mostly as rough, low-resolution estimates, pieced together from satellite data that can only reveal broad, general shapes, rather than the fine detail needed to understand specific features clearly. Why does mapping the ocean floor prove so much more difficult than mapping the surface of a distant planet millions of miles away? The core problem comes down to water itself. Radar and standard optical cameras, the primary tools used to map surfaces from orbit, cannot penetrate ocean water effectively at all. Light and radio waves lose their signal within a relatively short distance once they enter deep water, making orbital mapping techniques that work perfectly well on dry land, or even on the surface of other planets, almost completely useless for mapping anything beneath the ocean's surface. Instead, mapping the seafloor in real detail generally requires sonar, sound waves sent downward from a ship or underwater vehicle, then carefully measured as they bounce back off the seafloor below. This process works reasonably well, but it is slow and genuinely expensive, requiring ships to physically travel across the specific area they intend to map, inch by inch, in a process that can take years to properly cover even a relatively modest stretch of ocean. The Mariana Trench itself has received more mapping attention than most other deep ocean regions, largely because of its fame as the single deepest point on the planet. Yet even here, significant portions of the trench and its surrounding region remain incompletely explored and poorly understood, especially away from the most famous and frequently visited sections near Challenger Deep itself. This enormous, ongoing gap in our own basic map of Earth's ocean floor carries real consequences beyond mere curiosity. Scientists cannot properly study, protect, or even fully understand marine ecosystems they have never actually observed or mapped in the first place. New species, new geological features, and entirely new types of ecosystems likely remain completely undiscovered simply because nobody has ever looked closely enough at the right specific location. The deepest, most extreme trench on the entire planet remains, in a very real and immediate sense, one of the true last unmapped frontiers left anywhere on Earth. And exploring it safely depends entirely on engineering technology, capable of surviving conditions that would instantly destroy almost anything else humans have ever built. Every vessel that has ever successfully reached the bottom of the Mariana Trench shares one absolutely critical design feature: a pressure hull built with extraordinary precision, engineered specifically to survive forces that would instantly destroy almost any other manufactured structure on Earth. Modern deep-diving submersibles typically rely on spherical pressure chambers built from advanced materials like titanium, chosen specifically for its unusual combination of strength, relatively light weight, and resistance to corrosion in seawater over repeated dives. The specific spherical shape matters just as much as the material itself. A sphere distributes crushing external force evenly across its entire surface, avoiding the dangerous weak points and stress concentrations that flat surfaces or sharp corners would inevitably create under this kind of extreme pressure. Building a pressure sphere capable of safely reaching Hadal depths, again and again across multiple dives, demands almost unimaginable manufacturing precision. Even a tiny imperfection, a microscopic bubble trapped inside the metal during casting, a barely visible crack invisible to the naked eye, can dramatically weaken the entire structure at exactly the kind of extreme pressure found at the bottom of this trench. Engineers test these pressure hulls extensively before ever risking a human passenger inside, using specialized equipment to detect flaws far too small for ordinary human eyes to notice on their own. What actually happens if a pressure hull fails at extreme Hadal depth? The physics involved are genuinely difficult to fully comprehend. At crushing pressures found near the bottom of the trench, a structural failure would not happen gradually, with some kind of slow leak or warning sign, giving anyone inside time to react. It would happen catastrophically and essentially instantly, the entire structure collapsing inward in a fraction of a second, far too fast for any human reaction time to matter at all. There would be no warning, and very likely no possibility of survival for anyone caught inside. This harsh, unforgiving reality explains why deep-sea exploration vehicles undergo such extraordinarily rigorous testing and certification before they are ever cleared to carry a human passenger to these kinds of depths. Every single weld, every material choice, every design detail receives careful scrutiny precisely because the consequences of even a small, seemingly minor mistake are so severe and immediate. Given these enormous risks, why do explorers keep choosing to make this journey at all? Partly it comes down to genuine scientific value, gathering direct observations and physical samples that remotely operated vehicles alone often cannot fully replicate or replace. But there is clearly something else at work too, a deeper pull toward directly experiencing the single, most extreme, remote environment our entire planet actually contains, something video footage alone, however detailed and impressive, simply cannot fully replace. As engineering technology continues advancing steadily, reaching the bottom of this trench has slowly become somewhat less impossibly rare than it once was during the decades following that first historic 1960 dive, yet it remains an achievement completed by only a small handful of people in all of recorded human history, a genuinely exclusive club built entirely around surviving conditions that would instantly kill almost anything else on Earth. Everything explored across this journey, from crushing pressure to ghostly fish, from ancient tectonic collisions to hidden chemical ecosystems, ultimately points toward one larger, unavoidable truth about the Mariana Trench. It stands simultaneously as one of Earth's last truly wild frontiers, and as unmistakable proof that no environment on this entire planet remains fully separate from human influence any longer. Consider everything this trench actually represents. It is a place shaped by tectonic forces that have been quietly grinding away for more than 50 million years, forces still actively reshaping the seafloor today, this very moment, whether or not anyone happens to be watching. It hosts creatures that gave up eyesight entirely, gave up rigid bone structure completely, and built entirely new biochemical systems from scratch, all in order to survive conditions that would instantly destroy virtually anything else alive on the surface of our planet. It even contains hidden ecosystems that manage to run entirely independent of sunlight, offering scientists a genuinely valuable working model for understanding what alien life on other worlds might realistically require in order to survive. And at the very same time, this exact same remote, extraordinary place already carries clear, measurable traces of human industrial pollution, chemicals, and plastic waste, buried deep inside sediment and animal tissue at the single most inaccessible point on the entire planet. The trench proves, in the clearest and most direct way imaginable, that human impact genuinely does reach everywhere on Earth now, even into environments separated from us by nearly 7 miles of crushing, lightless ocean water. This dual reality carries real stakes for the future, stakes that extend well beyond the trench itself. As deep sea mining moves closer to becoming a genuine industrial reality, driven by growing global demand for valuable minerals scattered across the ocean floor, scientists have raised serious and repeated concerns about the potential damage such large-scale operations could cause to fragile deep-sea ecosystems that remain, even now, barely understood or documented by researchers. Mining operations conducted in an environment this poorly mapped and understood risk, permanently destroying species, adaptations, and entire ecosystems before scientists even get a genuine chance to properly study or fully understand what exactly stands to be lost forever. Yet the trench also represents something considerably more hopeful than pure risk and warning alone. It stands as living proof that life finds a way to survive and even thrive under genuinely extraordinary conditions, adapting through means humans are only now beginning to fully understand and appreciate. The exact same biological adaptations that allow creatures to survive down here already carry real potential to inform new advances in medicine, in industrial manufacturing, and in humanity's much broader ongoing search for life somewhere else in the universe entirely. Nearly 7 miles beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in permanent darkness, under a weight equal to 50 jumbo jets pressing down on a single point, life continues on. It continues in forms stranger, more resilient, and more genuinely remarkable than most people ever imagine, in an environment that seems built entirely to destroy anything that dares enter it. The Mariana Trench remains one of the very last truly unexplored frontiers left anywhere on our own planet, still holding secrets that could reshape our fundamental understanding of biology, evolution, and life's absolute outer limits. Whether humanity chooses to protect that frontier or damage it before we ever get the chance to fully understand it, remains a question we are still actively answering right now, one decision at a time.